when a young businessman from Columbus purchased the abandoned Olai farmstead outside Marietta, Ohio several years ago. The real estate agent mentioned something peculiar about the basement. That section's been sealed off since the 1930s, she said, pointing to a wall of weathered bricks that seemed oddly out of place in the stone foundation. Previous owners never bothered opening it up. What he discovered behind those 91-year-old bricks would force historians to rewrite a dark chapter of Ohio's medical history, a chapter that powerful families had spent nearly a century trying to erase. The truth about Dr. Amos Fletcher's underground hospital during the cholera epidemic of 1832 was far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we continue with the story of what was found in that sealed basement, if you're fascinated by America's darkest medical secrets, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what state you're listening from. Stories like this exist in every corner of our nation, waiting to be uncovered. The discovery that would shake Marietta's historical foundation began with the simple desire to expand a root cellar. The summer of 1832 brought more than just oppressive heat to the rolling hills of southeastern Ohio. Cholera, the dreaded Blue Death, had crept up the Ohio River from New Orleans, leaving a trail of corpses in cities like Cincinnati and Portsmouth. By July, the disease had reached Washington County, and the small settlement of Marietta, barely 40 years old and home to fewer than 2,000 souls, found itself in the grip of mortal terror. Dr. Amos Fletcher arrived in Marietta that fateful summer with impeccable credentials from a University of Pennsylvania Medical School and letters of recommendation from physicians in Philadelphia. A tall, angular man with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely white hair, Fletcher carried himself with the authority of Eastern medical training in a frontier town where most doctors were little more than barber surgeons or traveling patent medicine salesmen. The Hollow family had settled their 100-acre farm 3 miles northeast of Marietta in 1798, when Ohio was still the Northwest Territory. Thomas Olai, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, had built the farmhouse with his own hands, using local limestone and timber from his land. By 1832, Thomas had been dead for 5 years, leaving property to his son, Marcus, a quiet man of 32 who farmed wheat and raised cattle with his wife Sarah and their 3 young children. Marcus Holloway was not a man of medicine, but he possessed something Dr. Fletcher desperately needed: a large, cool, isolated basement with stone walls that could be easily cleaned, and multiple rooms that could house patients away from the prying eyes of Marietta's increasingly panicked population. When Fletcher approached Marcus in late July with a proposal to establish a private isolation hospital for cholera patients whose families could afford specialized care, Marcus saw an opportunity to earn desperately needed cash during lean farming years. The arrangement seemed straightforward enough. Fletcher would pay Marcus $50 per month, more money than the farm generated in 3 months, to use the basement as a treatment facility for affluent patients from Marietta and surrounding settlements. The basement's natural coolness and separation from the main house would provide ideal conditions for isolating the sick, while Fletcher administered the latest medical treatments. Sarah Holloway expressed some reservations about housing diseased patients beneath their home, but Marcus reminded her of their mounting debts and the promise of financial security. Fletcher moved his medical equipment into the hallway basement in early August, transforming the largest room into what he called his treatment chamber. The basement original storage rooms became patient quarters, each fitted with a simple bed, wash basin, and chamber pot. Fletcher installed oil lamps throughout the space and brought in wooden tables for his instruments and medicines. To the casual observer, it appeared to be a well-equipped, if somewhat primitive, medical facility. What the Holloway family didn't know was that Dr. Amos Fletcher had been quietly dismissed from his position at Pennsylvania Hospital 6 months earlier for irregular practices and experimental procedures not sanctioned by the medical board. Fletcher's obsession with finding a cure for cholera had led him down increasingly dark paths, including unauthorized experiments on charity patients who had died under his care. His departure from Philadelphia had been arranged quietly with sealed letters and hushed conversations in university corridors. The first patient arrived at the Olai farm on August 15, 1832. Jacob Whitman, a prosperous grain merchant, brought his 22-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, who had begun showing the telltale signs of cholera, violent stomach cramps, explosive diarrhea, and the bluish tinge of the skin that gave the disease its terrifying nickname. Fletcher assured Whitman that Elizabeth would receive the finest care available west of Philadelphia, treatments based on the latest European medical theories that were simply unavailable in Marietta's crude public hospital. Whitman paid Fletcher's fee of $25, nearly a year's wages for a common laborer, and departed with the promise that he could visit his daughter in 3 days. Fletcher had insisted on a strict quarantine period to prevent the spread of infection, a policy that seemed both medically sound and professionally responsible. Elizabeth Whitman died that very night. Fletcher's treatment methods, unknown to the families who entrusted their loved ones to his care, were based on a radical theory he had developed during his final months in Philadelphia. Convinced that cholera was caused by an excess of corrupted humors in the blood, Fletcher believed that only the most aggressive purging and bloodletting could save patients. His graduated depletion therapy involved drawing enormous quantities of blood, sometimes up to 2 quarts from a single patient, while simultaneously administering massive doses of calam, a mercury-based compound that induced violent purging. The theory was not entirely without precedent. Bloodletting and mercury treatments were common in 1832 medical practice, but Fletcher's doses were extreme, even by the standards of the day. A typical physician might draw 8 to 12 ounces of blood from a cholera patient. Fletcher routinely drew 10 times that amount, where other doctors administered calomel in grain-sized doses. Fletcher's therapeutic doses contain enough mercury to poison a healthy man. Fletcher kept meticulous records of his treatments, documenting each patient's response in a leather-bound journal that he stored in a locked wooden box. These records, written in Fletcher's precise hand, would later provide the most damning evidence of what transpired in the hallway basement during those terrible months. Patient exhibits typical caloric symptoms upon admission, Fletcher wrote, of Elizabeth Whitman. Commenced graduated depletion at 2:00 p.m. with initial bleeding of 24 ounces. Patients, pulse weakened but complexion improved. Administered 15 grains calomel with laudanum. Second bleeding of 20 ounces at 6 p.m. produced marked improvement in humoral balance. Patient resting comfortably. Third bleeding scheduled for midnight to complete initial purification cycle. What Fletcher described as marked improvement was actually the progressive weakening of a young woman whose body was being systematically drained of its ability to fight disease. Elizabeth Whitman died not of cholera, but of acute blood loss and mercury poisoning, her body finally succumbing to Fletcher's cure rather than the disease itself. Fletcher buried Elizabeth in a crude grave behind a farmhouse, telling Marcus Holloway that immediate burial was necessary to prevent contagion. When Jacob Whitman arrived 3 days later to visit his daughter, Fletcher informed him with practiced solemnity that Elizabeth had died peacefully in her sleep after initially responding well to treatment. The disease progressed too rapidly for even the most advanced medical intervention. Fletcher explained, "I'm deeply sorry for your loss, Mr. Whitman. I did everything medical science allowed." Whitman, consumed by grief and grateful that his daughter had at least died under professional medical care rather than in the overcrowded chaos of Marietta's public hospital, paid Fletcher an additional $10 for burial expenses and departed none the wiser. The second patient arrived on August 20th, Thomas Carmichael, a 45-year-old blacksmith from nearby Belpre, whose family had pulled their savings to afford Fletcher's private treatment. Carmichael lasted 4 days under Fletcher's graduated depletion therapy before succumbing to the same combination of blood loss and mercury poisoning that killed Elizabeth Whitman. By September, word of Fletcher's private hospital had spread throughout southeastern Ohio. Desperate families terrified by the rising death toll in public hospitals where patients were lucky to receive any treatment beyond prayer and crude palliative care began arriving at the Oli farm with their life savings and their dying loved ones. Fletcher's Eastern credentials and professional manner inspired confidence in people who had never encountered a university-trained physician. The basement that had once stored grain and preserves now housed a steady stream of patients who paid premium prices to die under Fletcher's methodical care. Fletcher had created the perfect criminal enterprise, a clientele whose desperation made them willing to pay any price, a disease whose high mortality rate made deaths unsuspicious, and an isolated location where his activities could proceed without oversight. By October 1832, Fletcher had refined his operation into a grotesquely efficient system. New patients were brought to the basement through a separate entrance he had Marcus install, ostensibly to maintain quarantine protocols, but actually to limit witnesses to his activities. Fletcher charged different rates based on families' perceived wealth. $25 for merchants and professionals, $15 for skilled craftsmen, $10 for farmers with modest holdings. Fletcher had also begun charging additional fees for specialized treatments and experimental therapies that he claimed were based on the latest European medical advances. Families desperate to save their loved ones often paid these supplemental charges without question, trusting that a university-trained physician knew best how to combat the dreaded cholera. The Holloway family, initially grateful for the steady income Fletcher provided, began to notice disturbing patterns. Despite Fletcher's assurances that his advanced treatments produced superior results, every single patient brought to their basement eventually died. Sarah, Oli, whose maternal instincts were sharpened by fear for her own children's safety, began to question whether the basement was truly as safe as Fletcher claimed. "It don't seem natural," Sarah confided to her husband one evening in late October as they listened to the weak moaning of Fletcher's latest patient drifting up through the floorboards. "All them fancy treatments, all that book, learning, and still every soul dies down there. Even old Doc Hartwell in town saves 1 out of every 3 or 4. Marcus dismissed his wife's concerns with the practical fatalism of a farmer who had watched livestock die despite his best efforts. "Rich folks get sick same as poor folks," he told her. "Maybe they just wait too long before bringing them out here, thinking their money will buy them a miracle." What Marcus and Sarah didn't know was that Fletcher had begun supplementing his income through even more sinister means. After each patient died, Fletcher performed what he called post-mortem examinations to advance his understanding of calories' effects on the human body. In reality, these examinations were crude dissections during which Fletcher removed organs and tissue samples that he preserved in alcohol and sold to medical schools in Cincinnati and Columbus. The illegal trade in human anatomical specimens was a poorly kept secret in American medical education. Medical schools desperate for cadavers to train their students often paid handsomely for fresh specimens. Few questions asked. Fletcher's collar victims, already isolated from their families and buried quickly to prevent contagion, provided perfect raw material for this gruesome commerce. Fletcher's journal entries from this period reveal the cold calculation behind his activities. Patient HRS expired at 3:20 a.m. following completion of depletion cycle. Immediate post-mortem examination yielded excellent specimens. Liver, showing advanced caloric deterioration. Kidney specimens suitable for preservation. Heart muscle displaying typical post-mortem changes. Total value of specimens estimated at $12. Net profit from Hendrick's case, $37 after burial and preservation expenses. The basement began to take on the characteristics of a corral house disguised as a medical facility. Fletcher installed a large wooden table in one of the smaller rooms where he conducted his examinations along with an array of surgical instruments and glass jars filled with preserving alcohol. The limestone walls, naturally cool and easy to clean, made perfect storage for his growing collection of anatomical specimens awaiting shipment to medical Schools. Fletcher's carefully constructed enterprise began to unravel in November 1832, when two events occurred almost simultaneously that would expose the true nature of his basement hospital. The first was the arrival of Martha Cunningham, the 16-year-old daughter of Reverend Isaiah Cunningham, pastor of Marietta's First Presbyterian Church. Martha had contracted cholera while caring for the sick in the church's charity hospital, and Reverend Cunningham, despite his modest preacher's salary, had borrowed heavily to afford Fletcher's private treatment for his only child. Unlike Fletcher's previous patients, Martha arrived at the Holloway basement in the very early stages of cholera, when the disease was most treatable with rest, clear fluids, and basic supportive care. She was young, strong, and otherwise healthy, exactly the type of patient who might survive even Fletcher's brutal treatment regimen long enough for someone to witness what was actually happening in the basement. The second critical event was the unexpected early return of Dr. Benjamin Hartwell from Columbus, where he had been attending a medical conference on cholera treatment. Dr. Hartwell, Marietta's only other trained physician, had been curious about the reportedly excellent results Fletcher was achieving with his private patients. Professional courtesy and genuine medical interest prompted Hartwell to visit the Holloway farm on November 12th to discuss treatment methods with his colleague. What Dr. Hartwell discovered in the Olai basement that cold November morning would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hartwell arrived at the farm around 10 a.m., expecting to find Fletcher conducting rounds, or perhaps consulting with the Olai family about quarantine procedures. Instead, he found the basement entrance unlocked and descended the stone steps to investigate the sight that greeted him. In Fletcher's treatment chamber defied comprehension for a man trained in legitimate medical practice. Martha Cunningham lay unconscious on Fletcher's treatment table, her skin waxy and pale from massive blood loss. Beside the table sat two large basins filled with blood, and Fletcher was in the process of preparing a syringe filled with what Hartwell recognized as a lethal dose of calomel. In the corner of the room, glass jars containing human organs floated in alcohol like grotesque museum specimens. Fletcher, Hartwell called, "Out!" his voice echoing in the stone chamber. "What in God's name are you doing to this child?" Fletcher spun around, his blood-stained apron and wild expression make him look more like a butcher than physician. For a moment, the two men stared at each other across the unconscious form of Martha Cunningham, the full horror of Fletcher's activities hanging between them like a poison cloud. "Dr. Hartwell," Fletcher said finally, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "I wasn't expecting you. Miss Cunningham is responding remarkably well to graduated depletion therapy. I was just preparing to administer the final dose of mercurial purification." Hartwell rushed to Martha's side, checking her pulse and examining her pupils. "This girl is dying of blood loss, not cholera," he said. "How much blood have you drawn from her?" Fletcher consulted his journal with clinical detachment. 42 ounces over the past 18 hours, with an additional 16 scheduled for this morning's treatment. The humoral balance is nearly achieved. 42 ounces. Hartwell's voice rose in disbelief. "That's nearly 3 quarts. You've bled this child almost to death." What followed was a heated argument that could be heard throughout the farmhouse. Above, Fletcher defended his methods with increasing desperation, citing European medical theories and his own clinical observations. Hartwell, appalled by what he was witnessing, demanded that Fletcher cease treatment immediately and allow him to examine the other patients. The argument ended abruptly when Hartwell discovered that Martha Cunningham was Fletcher's only living patient. The other beds in the basement were empty, their occupants having died under Fletcher's care and been buried in the growing cemetery behind the farmhouse. "Where are your other patients?" Hartwell demanded. Fletcher's response was delivered with chilling matter-of-factness. "Unfortunately, they succumbed to the advanced stages of choric infection before my treatments could take effect. The disease is particularly virulent this season," Hartwell's medical training told him. immediately that something was terribly wrong. Even during the worst cholera outbreaks, mortality rates rarely exceeded 60% with proper care. Fletcher claimed to be providing the finest treatment available, yet his mortality rate appeared to be 100%. Dr. Hartwell's discovery of Fletcher's activities created an impossible situation for everyone involved. Hartwell faced a moral and professional obligation to expose Fletcher's deadly practices, but doing so would implicate the Holloway family, who had provided the facility, and potentially destroy the reputations of the families who had paid for Fletcher's services. In the small, tightly knit community of Washington County, scandal could destroy lives as surely as disease. The families who had entrusted their loved ones to Fletcher were among Marietta's most prominent citizens, merchants, craftsmen, and landowners whose social standing depended on their reputation for good judgment and moral character. To admit they had been deceived by a charlatan would bring shame that could last generations. Hartwell immediately began treating Martha Cunningham with fluids and rest, hoping to reverse the damage Fletcher had inflicted. Meanwhile, he sent word to Reverend Cunningham and several other prominent citizens, requesting their immediate presence at the Hollow Farm for a matter of gravest importance regarding Dr. Fletcher's medical practices. The men who gathered in the Olai farmhouse that afternoon represented the power structure of Marietta society. Reverend Cunningham, Judge William Putnam, Merchant Samuel Fearing, and banker Nathan Gilman each had either entrusted family members to Fletcher's care or had recommended Fletcher to friends and neighbors. Hartwell's revelation of Fletcher's activities hit the group like a physical blow. The respected Eastern physician they had welcomed into their community was revealed as a killer who had systematically murdered their loved ones while charging premium prices for privilege. The basement they were standing above contained evidence of medical fraud, malpractice, and possibly deliberate murder. Fletcher, cornered and facing the collapse of everything he had built, made a desperate attempt to justify his actions. He produced his journal and began reading excerpts that documented each patient's treatment, arguing that his methods were based on legitimate medical theory and that the high mortality rate was due to the severity of the cholera outbreak, not his treatment protocols. "Gentlemen," Fletcher said, his voice taking on the lecturing tone of a medical school professor, "I understand your shock at witnessing advanced medical procedures. What appears extreme to untrained eyes is actually the application of the most current European medical science. Every treatment I administered was designed to save life, not take it." Judge Putnam, whose own nephew had died under Fletcher's care just 2 weeks earlier, was having none of Fletcher's explanations. "Dr. Fletcher," he said coldly, "are you telling us that bleeding a 16-year-old girl nearly to death is accepted medical practice? In cases of severe humoral imbalance, yes," Fletcher replied without hesitation. "The corruption must be drawn from a body before healing can begin. Miss Cunningham's survival will prove the effectiveness of my methods." But Martha Cunningham did not survive. Despite Hartwell's efforts to reverse the damage, she died that evening, her young body too weakened by Fletcher's treatments to recover. Her death in the presence of witnesses finally provided the irrefutable proof that Fletcher's methods were not medicine, but murder. The death of Martha Cunningham in front of multiple witnesses transformed Fletcher from a respected physician into an obvious killer. But the group of men gathered at the Holloway farmhouse faced a terrible dilemma: how to deal with Fletcher without destroying themselves and their community in the process. A public trial would expose the full scope of Fletcher's activities, revealing that Marietta's leading citizens had been systematically deceived and their loved ones murdered. The scandal would reach far beyond Washington County, potentially destroying the carefully cultivated reputation of Marietta as a civilized, well-governed community. Property values would plummet, businesses would fail, and families would be ruined by association with Fletcher's crimes. Judge Putnam, despite his personal anguish over his nephew's death, recognized the broader implications of Fletcher's exposure. If this becomes public, he told the group, grimly, It will destroy not just our reputations, but our entire community. Who will do business with merchants who couldn't recognize a charlatan, who will trust a judge who recommended a killer? To his neighbors, Reverend Cunningham, grief-stricken over his daughter's death, but mindful of his congregation's welfare, agreed that some form of private justice might be preferable to public exposure. The families who lost loved ones deserve to know the truth, he said, but they also deserve to live with dignity in this community. A public trial would destroy the innocent along with the guilty. The decision was made to confront Fletcher privately and demand his immediate departure from Ohio. The evidence of his crimes would be gathered and preserved, but not made public, unless Fletcher refused to leave voluntarily. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but seemed to offer the best chance of protecting the community from further damage. Fletcher, however, refused to cooperate with the plan. Cornered and desperate, he declared that he would rather face public trial than abandon his medical research and flee like a common criminal. He threatened to expose the complicity of the Holloway family and other community members who had profited from his activities, claiming that any attempt to force his departure would result in scandal for everyone involved. The standoff continued to the night of November 12th, with Fletcher barricaded in the basement while the community leaders debated their options in the farmhouse above. Marcus Holloway, terrified that his family would be destroyed by association with Fletcher's crimes, begged the group to find a solution that would protect innocent people from the consequences of Fletcher's actions. The confrontation reached its climax just before dawn on November 13th, when Fletcher attempted to escape through the basement's exterior entrance. Judge Putnam and Samuel Fearing, who had been watching the exit, confronted Fletcher in the pre-dawn darkness behind the farmhouse. What happened next would be debated in whispers for years afterward. Fletcher was found dead at sunrise, his skull crushed by what appeared to be a fall against the stone steps of the basement entrance. Judge Putnam claimed that Fletcher had slipped while trying to flee, striking his head on the limestone blocks. Samuel Fearing supported this account, stating that Fletcher's death was clearly accidental. Dr. Hartwell, examining Fletcher's body, found evidence that suggested a more violent end than a simple fall. But, faced with a choice between exposing what appeared to be vigilante justice and protecting the community from further scandal, Hartwell recorded Fletcher's death as accidental trauma, resulting from a fall. Fletcher's death solved the immediate problem of what to do with a killer who refused to leave quietly, but it created new challenges for the community leaders who now had to conceal not just medical fraud, but also what appeared to be murder. The basement full of evidence, Fletcher's journal, his surgical instruments, the preserved organs, and the makeshift treatment facility had to be dealt with quickly and permanently. The decision was made to seal the basement completely, entombing all evidence of Fletcher's activities and creating a permanent monument to the community's darkest secret. Marcus Holloway, desperate to distance his family from the scandal, agreed to brick up the basement entrance and never speak of what had transpired there. The official story, carefully crafted and consistently told, was that Dr. Fletcher had died in an accidental fall while treating cholera patients in his private hospital. His sudden death had made it necessary to abandon and seal the basement facility to prevent the spread of infection. The patients who had died under Fletcher's care were victims of the cholera epidemic, nothing more. Reverend Cunningham conducted a simple burial service for Fletcher, attended only by the men who knew the truth about his activities. Fletcher was interred in the Marietta Cemetery with a modest headstone that identified him simply as Dr. A. Fletcher's 1796-1832 taken by accident in service to his patients. The families who had lost loved ones under Fletcher's care were quietly informed that their relatives had died of cholera despite receiving the finest medical treatment available. Most accepted this explanation, grateful to believe that their family members had died under professional care rather than in the chaos of the public hospital. Hartwell destroyed his own notes about Fletcher's activities and never spoke publicly about what he had discovered in the Olai basement. The trauma of witnessing Fletcher's crimes and their violent resolution affected Hartwell. Deeply, he began drinking heavily and died just 3 years later, taking his knowledge of the truth to his grave. Marcus Holloway used locally quarried limestone to build a wall, sealing the basement entrance, making it appear that the space had always been separate from the main foundation. He planted ivy around the exterior entrance and allowed it to grow over the stones, creating the impression that the sealed area had been abandoned for many years. The Hollow family never spoke of their basements. Dark history, even among themselves. Marcus destroyed the furniture and equipment that Fletcher had brought to the farm, burning what could be burned and burying the rest in unmarked graves, scattered across his property. Within a year, the only physical evidence of Fletcher's activities was a sealed basement itself, hidden behind a wall of limestone and silence. The secret of the Holloway basement passed from Marcus to his son Thomas, and from Thomas to his son Robert. Each generation of Holloways maintained the sealed basement as they had inherited it, understanding that opening it would resurrect a family. Shame too terrible to confront. The limestone wall became part of the farmhouse's foundation, so integral to the structure that later generations forgot it had ever been anything else. As decades passed, the cholera epidemic of 1832 became a distant memory, recalled only in church records and cemetery headstones. The families who had lost loved ones under Fletcher's care passed down stories of relatives who had died during the terrible plague year, grateful for the care they had received from a dedicated Eastern physician who had given his own life in service to his patients. Dr. Fletcher's reputation, carefully preserved by the cover-up, actually improved with time. He became remembered as a heroic figure who had brought advanced medical knowledge to the frontier and died tragically while treating the sick. Several Marietta families named sons Amos in his honor, and the town's medical society established a small scholarship in Fletcher's memory. The Olai farm prospered over the decades, its dark secret buried beneath productive fields and growing livestock herds. Marcus lived to age 78, taking his knowledge of Fletcher's crimes to his grave in 1878. Sarah died 10 years later, having never spoken of the terrible months when their basement had housed Fletcher's Chamber of Horrors. By 1900, when the original witnesses to Fletcher's activities had all died, the sealed basement had become simply an architectural curiosity, a space that served no purpose, but was too expensive to excavate and renovate. The Holloway descendants, who inherited the property in the early 20th century, occasionally considered opening the space, but were deterred by the cost and inconvenience of major construction work. The Great Depression forced the sale of the Holloway farm to pay taxes and debts, ending more than a century of family ownership. The new owners, immigrants from Eastern Europe, who spoke little English and cared nothing for local history, farmed the land efficiently, but took no interest in the farmhouse's peculiarities. They sealed off entire sections of the house to save on heating costs, including the area above the mysterious bricked-up basement. Through the 20th century, the Holloway farmhouse changed hands multiple times as agriculture in southeastern Ohio gave way to suburban development and industrial activity. Each set of owners noted the sealed basement, but assumed it was a result of structural problems or water damage. No one thought to investigate what lay behind the limestone wall. When a young businessman from Columbus purchased the abandoned Olai farmstead several years ago, he intended to renovate the 19th century farmhouse as a weekend retreat. The property's isolation and historical character appealed to him, and the price was reasonable for a house that needed extensive renovation work. He hired local contractors to update the electrical and plumbing systems work that required access to the basement for utility installations. When the contractors encountered the bricked-up section, they initially assumed it was a failed renovation project from decades past. Building codes and insurance requirements, however, demanded that they verify the structural integrity of the sealed space before proceeding with major electrical work. On a cold morning in early spring, the new owner and his Contractor began carefully removing the limestone blocks that had sealed the basement for 91 years. The mortar had hardened like concrete over the decades, requiring power tools and considerable effort to break through the barrier that Marcus Holloway had erected in November 1832. The first indication that something was seriously wrong came from the smell, a musty organic odor that suggested decades of stagnant air and possibly biological decay. As more stones were removed, the contractor began to see evidence of the space beyond: wooden furniture, metal objects, and what appeared to be glass containers reflecting their flashlight beams. When the opening was finally large enough to admit a person, the new owner descended into Fletcher's preserved chamber of horrors with a flashlight, becoming the first human being to enter the space since November 1832. What he found there would shake the foundations of local historical understanding. Fletcher's treatment table still stood in the center of the main room, its wooden surface stained dark with what appeared to be dried blood. The surgical instruments Fletcher had used lay scattered across smaller tables, their metal surfaces corroded, but still recognizable as medical tools from the early 19th century. Glass jars that had once contained preserving alcohol-lined wooden shelves, their contents long since evaporated, but leaving residue that would prove significant. Most dramatically, Fletcher's leather-bound journal lay open. On a wooden desk, its pages yellowed and brittle, but still legible after nearly 2 centuries. The precise handwriting that documented Fletcher's systematic murder of his patients provided an immediately recognizable record of medical crimes that had been hidden for almost a century. The owner, recognizing the historical significance of his discovery, immediately contacted local historical authorities and archaeological experts. Within days, the sealed basement became the focus of intense investigation as historians and medical experts worked to piece together the story of what had transpired there. During the cholera epidemic of 1832, the investigation of Fletcher's basement laboratory revealed evidence that exceeded even the darkest suspicions about 19th century medical practice. Analysis of the preserved materials provided conclusive proof that Fletcher had systematically killed his patients through deliberate medical malpractice, confirming the accounts recorded in his journal. Testing of residue found in Fletcher's medicine bottles revealed mercury concentrations high enough to kill a healthy adult within hours. Blood stains on Fletcher's equipment showed evidence of multiple individuals, suggesting that the basement had been used to treat far more patients than the journal documented. Most disturbing, examination of the area behind the farmhouse revealed evidence of at least 12 human burials, indicating that Fletcher's victim count exceeded even his own careful records. The historical investigation that followed the basement's discovery transformed understanding of medical practice in early Ohio and raised serious questions about how Fletcher's crimes had been concealed for so long. Examination of church records, death certificates, and family documents from the 1830s revealed patterns that should have raised suspicions at the time, but apparently didn't or were deliberately ignored. Medical historians who studied the case described Fletcher's operation as one of the most systematic cases of medical murder in American frontier history, concealed by a community conspiracy that prioritized reputation over justice. The evidence suggested that Fletcher had killed at least 24 people over a 4-month period, collecting fees that represented enormous sums of the time. The discovery also revealed the length to which prominent citizens had gone to conceal Fletcher's crimes and protect their own reputations. Analysis of contemporary documents showed that the cover-up extended far beyond the immediate witnesses involving courthouse officials who altered death records, local leaders who suppressed unfavorable stories, and religious authorities who provided false testimony about Fletcher's character. Perhaps most disturbing was evidence that Fletcher's activities were not entirely unique. Research prompted by the basement discovery revealed similar suspicious patterns in other Ohio communities during the same period, suggesting that medical fraud and malpractice were more common than previously understood. The isolation of frontier medical practice and the desperation of families facing epidemic disease created perfect conditions for predators like Fletcher to operate with impunity. The Holloway basement discovery forced a reassessment of how medical practice was regulated in early America and raised questions about how many other respected physicians might have been operating similar enterprises in communities across the expanding frontier. The evidence suggested that Fletcher's crimes were concealed not by sophisticated criminal planning, but by the simple willingness of a community to prioritize its reputation over justice for his victims. The excavation of Fletcher's basement laboratory continued for months as investigators carefully documented and preserved evidence of crimes that had been hidden for nearly 2 centuries. Local medical authorities acknowledged Fletcher's crimes and the failures of oversight that had allowed them to occur, while historical societies worked to honor those who had died under his care. The investigation also revealed the human cost of the community's decision to conceal Fletcher's activities rather than seek justice. Through legal channels, families who had trusted Fletcher with their loved ones had been deceived not only by a criminal physician, but by their own community leaders who had prioritized reputation, management over truth and accountability. Analysis of remains found behind the farmhouse confirmed the identities of several victims whose families had been told they died of natural causes. The revelation that these deaths were actually murders came as a shock to descendants who had carried family stories of loss during the cholera epidemic, never suspecting that their ancestors had been victims of deliberate crimes. The Hollow family descendants, scattered across the country over the generations since the farm sale, expressed mixed feelings about the discovery. Some were horrified to learn that their family property had been the site of such terrible crimes, while others felt vindicated that a long-held family secret had finally been exposed. Several family members reported that they had grown up with vague stories about something bad that had happened in the basement, but no one had preserved specific knowledge of Fletcher's activities. The investigation also raised troubling questions about medical practice and oversight. While systems had improved dramatically since Fletcher's time, medical historians noted that isolated practice settings and vulnerable patient populations still created opportunities for abuse that might not be detected for years or decades. The farmhouse where Fletcher conducted his terrible experiments has become a subject of intense historical interest. Fletcher's basement laboratory was preserved exactly as it was found, providing researchers with a stark reminder of how inadequate regulation and community denial enabled systematic abuse of vulnerable people. The leather-bound journal that documented Fletcher's crimes has been preserved as a primary source for understanding medical fraud in the antebellum period. Fletcher's surgical instruments and preserved specimens provided evidence for studies of medical ethics and the history of physician misconduct. The property owner who uncovered this dark chapter of medical history chose historical preservation over personal renovation. The significance of Fletcher's basement as evidence of systematic medical crime was deemed more important than modern convenience. The investigation sparked by the basement discovery led to similar examinations at other historical medical sites across Ohio and neighboring states. Researchers identified several other locations where suspicious patterns of patient deaths during the 1830s cholera epidemic suggested possible medical fraud or malpractice. While none yielded evidence as dramatic as Fletcher's basement laboratory, the discoveries prompted a broader reassessment of medical practice regulation in early America. The families of Fletcher's victims, identified through genealogical research and analysis of remains, worked to establish memorials that emphasize the importance of transparency and accountability in medical practice, values that were tragically absent during Fletcher's reign of terror in the hallway basement. Dr. Fletcher's grave in Marietta Cemetery became a subject of controversy after the discovery of his crimes. Some descendants of his victims petitioned for his removal from the section reserved for honored community members, arguing that a murderer should not rest among those he had deceived. Others maintained that moving the grave would accomplish nothing, and that Fletcher's headstone served as a reminder of how easily communities could be deceived by those who exploited professional authority. The cholera epidemic of 1832, which provided Fletcher with the perfect cover for his crimes, killed thousands of people across Ohio during its peak. Months. Historical records suggest that Fletcher was responsible for a tiny fraction of those deaths. But his systematic abuse of trust and deliberate murder of patients seeking help represents one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. Medical ethicists who studied Fletcher's case identified several factors that enabled his crimes. The isolation of rural medical practice, the desperation of families facing epidemic disease, the lack of effective medical licensing and oversight, and, most critically, a community's willingness to prioritize reputation over justice when confronted with evidence of systematic abuse. The discovery in a hallway basement raises questions that extend far beyond the specific crimes of Dr. Amos Fletcher. How many other physicians in early America operated similar enterprises using epidemic disease as cover for systematic fraud and murder? How many communities chose to conceal evidence of medical crimes rather than face the scandal of exposure? How many families carried false stories of heroic medical care, never knowing that their loved ones had actually been murdered by the very people they trusted to provide healing? The limestone wall that concealed Fletcher's crimes for 91 years stands as a monument to the power of collective denial and the length to which communities will go to protect their reputations. But it also demonstrates the persistence of truth and the inevitable consequences of trying to bury evidence of systematic abuse rather than confronting it honestly. Fletcher's journal, with its meticulous documentation of medical murder disguised as treatment, provides a chilling reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who operate behind facades of respectability and professional authority. His victims trusted him not in spite of credentials, but because of them, making their betrayal even more profound and his crimes even more inexcusable. The basement that once housed Fletcher's Chamber of Horrors now serves as a reminder where researchers and the public can learn about the importance of oversight, transparency, and accountability in healthcare. The preservation of this dark history serves not to sensationalize past crimes, but to prevent future ones by maintaining awareness of how easily trust can be betrayed and how quickly healing can become harm when proper safeguards are absent. Perhaps the most important lesson from Fletcher's basement is that silence in the face of evidence never truly conceals crime. It only delays justice and multiplies harm. The community leaders who chose to seal Fletcher's laboratory rather than expose his crimes thought they were protecting their neighbors from scandal and shame. Instead, they created a deeper shame that could only be resolved when the truth finally emerged nearly 2 centuries later. The discovery in Fletcher's basement laboratory confronted investigators with a scene of crimes that shocked even experienced historians. The experience was deliberately preserved to remind future generations of what can happen when medical authority is abused and communities choose denial over accountability. Historical studies emphasize that Fletcher's crimes were not the product of primitive 19th century medicine, but a deliberate choices made by an individual who used a professional authority to exploit vulnerable people. Medical practice, while improved in terms of regulation and oversight, still required constant vigilance to prevent similar abuses from occurring. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in the hallway basement intensifies our understanding of how easily trust can be betrayed and how important it is to maintain accountability in healthcare. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together how many other secrets might be hidden behind the walls of America's historical buildings. The Fletcher case also highlights the importance of preserving difficult history rather than concealing it. The temptation to hide evidence of past crimes or mistakes is strong, but the Holloway basement demonstrates that truth has a way of emerging eventually, often when we least expect it. Communities that face their dark histories honestly rather than trying to bury them are better equipped to prevent similar tragedies in the future. Medical fraud and abuse continued to occur in healthcare systems throughout American history, often enabled by the same factors that allowed Fletcher to operate: professional authority, vulnerable patients, and institutional reluctance to investigate respected colleagues. The Fletcher case serves as a reminder that vigilance and accountability are not optional features of medical practice, but essential safeguards that protect patients from those who would exploit their trust. The basement laboratory also represents the broader American experience of confronting uncomfortable truths about the past. From slavery to medical experimentation to industrial abuse, American history is filled with examples of communities that chose silence over accountability, often with devastating consequences for victims and their descendants. The Fletcher case demonstrates that while concealment may provide temporary protection from scandal, it inevitably creates greater shame and deeper harm than honest confrontation with difficult truths. The story of Dr. Amos Fletcher and his basement laboratory of horrors reminds us that some of history's greatest monsters have operated not in the shadows, but in plain sight, protected by professional credentials and community respect. Fletcher's systematic murder of Cal-era patients under the guise of medical treatment represents one of the most chilling examples of how trust can be weaponized against the very people it should protect. The 91 years that Fletcher's crimes remained hidden behind a limestone wall serve as a testament to both the power of collective denial and the persistence of truth. No matter how carefully communities try to bury evidence of systematic abuse, that evidence has a way of emerging, often when we least expect it, and in ways that force us to confront not just past crimes, but our own complicity in concealing them. The families who paid Fletcher premium prices to murder their loved ones were victims of more than medical fraud. They were victims of a system that prioritized reputation over accountability and chose silence over justice. Their descendants learning the truth about their ancestors' deaths nearly 2 centuries later remind us that the consequences of concealment extend far beyond the immediate participants and can affect generations who had no part in the original crimes. Fletcher's leather-bound journal, with its meticulous documentation of medical murder, stands as evidence that even the most methodical criminals eventually leave traces of their activities. But it also demonstrates that written records mean nothing without people willing to read them, investigate them, and act on what they reveal. The journal sat in Fletcher's basement for 91 years, documenting crimes that no one was willing to acknowledge. This mystery shows us that the greatest threats to public safety often come not from obvious criminals, but from respected professionals who exploit their authority to harm the very people they're supposed to help. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or might there be other basement laboratories hidden in America's historical buildings? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.